Dear, precious listener, I want to thank you for wanting to listen to my stories. I am proud of it and grateful if you contribute to helping me build this channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing. I know you think it doesn't matter, but it means a lot to me. And another thing that is also important to me, I love to see what country they are from who listen to my stories. So please write it in a comment and maybe a little message in addition. Thank you for this contribution. I want to start reading then. The story I'm reading to you today is called Under the Same Sky, a story of love and impossibility. Stephen was a man the town spoke of often, usually with a mix of admiration and exasperation. He was 24 years old, with a lean, muscular frame honed by years of hauling nets and braving the sea's harsh conditions. His skin was kissed golden by the sun, and his brown hair had a natural tousle that seemed to mock the idea of order. But it was his smile, a roguish, boyish grin that truly set him apart. It could charm a merchant into lowering a price or coax a laugh from even the sternest of dockmasters. Stephen loved his life, and it showed in the way he carried himself, light on his feet, quick with a joke, and always ready for a good time. But his charm came with a carefree attitude that often bordered on recklessness. "Stephen Taylor," his closest friend Peter often teased, "you'll drown in the sea one day, not because of a storm, but because you're too busy chasing a seagull for its fish." Stephen would laugh, brushing off the remark with a wave of his hand. "If I'm going to drown, let it be for something worth it." Stephen's origins. Stephen hadn't always been the carefree young man the town knew. His beginnings were humble, even tragic. His parents, Matthew and Eleanor Taylor, were simple folk, a fisherman and a seamstress who loved their son deeply. They taught him the values of hard work and kindness, instilling in him a love for the sea and an appreciation for life's simple joys. But tragedy struck when Stephen was only 9. A storm, fierce and unrelenting, claimed his father's life. The sea that had provided for them had turned cruel, leaving Stephen and his mother to fend for themselves. Eleanor worked tirelessly to keep food on the table, taking in extra sewing jobs late into the night. Stephen often watched her, his small hands clutching a fishing rod he could barely hold. "One day, I'll be the man of the house," he promised her, his voice filled with childish determination. Eleanor would smile, brushing his hair back. "You already are, my love." But when Stephen was 14, illness claimed his mother as well. Left orphaned, he was taken in by his uncle, Thomas, a stern fisherman with little patience for sentimentality. Thomas taught Stephen the trade, how to mend nets, read the tides, and respect the ocean. But he offered little in the way of warmth. "The sea doesn't care about your feelings," Thomas often said. "You'd do well to remember that." Stephen learned quickly, his natural instincts for fishing earning him a grudging respect from his uncle. But the boy who once dreamed of becoming the man of the house grew into a young man who sought to escape his pain in the pleasures of life. Life in West Haven. By the time Stephen reached his 20s, he had become one of the most skilled fishermen in West Haven. He was dependable when it came to work, but when the nets were hauled in and the day's labor was done, Stephen could be found in the tavern, laughing with friends and spinning stories. He had a reputation for being fun-loving and flirtatious, often leaving with one of the local girls who couldn't resist his charm. "You'll settle down one day?" Peter teased him one evening as they sat at the bar, mugs of ale in hand. Stephen smirked. "Why settle for one when the world is full of possibilities?" Peter shook his head, his broad shoulders shaking with laughter. "You're impossible, Stephen, but mark my words, there's a woman out there who will make you forget every other." Stephen laughed, raising his mug. "Then let her come find me." A world apart, while Stephen revelled in the simplicity of West Haven life, Alexandra Sinclair lived in a world of refinement and privilege. Her father, Edward Sinclair, was one of the wealthiest men in town, owning a fleet of merchant ships that traded goods across distant ports. The Sinclair estate, perched on a hill overlooking the harbour, was a testament to their success, a grand house with sprawling gardens and polished wooden floors that gleamed in the sunlight. Alexandra was the jewel of the Sinclair family. Her auburn hair shimmered in the light, her emerald green eyes sparkled with intelligence, and her every movement exuded grace. She had been educated by the best tutors, learning languages, mathematics, and the fine art of diplomacy. But her beauty and poise were matched by a strong will and a sharp mind. Alexandra, her mother, Margaret, often said, "You are not just beautiful, you are powerful. Never let anyone forget that." Alexandra took her responsibilities seriously. She managed her father's accounts, negotiated with merchants, and oversaw the construction of new ships. Her reputation for elegance and competence extended beyond West Haven, attracting suitors from nearby towns and even distant cities. "Every eligible man in the region wants to marry you," Margaret remarked one afternoon as they prepared for a dinner party. "But none of them know me," Alexandra replied, her tone thoughtful. "They see a name, a fortune, a face. I want more than that." A fateful day. The day Stephen and Alexandra's worlds collided began like any other. The harbour was alive with activity, the air filled with the sounds of shouting dock workers and the creak of wooden ships. Alexandra had come to oversee a shipment of textiles bound for the south. She wore a tailored navy dress with a pearl brooch, her hair pinned neatly under a wide-brimmed hat. Her presence turned heads as she strode confidently through the chaos, clipboard in hand. Stephen was nearby, unloading a particularly large haul of fish. His shirt was damp with sweat, clinging to his well-defined chest. As he hefted a crate onto the dock, he caught sight of Alexandra. For a moment, time seemed to slow. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen, poised, elegant, and utterly out of place among the rough-and-tumble workers of the harbour. "Who's that?" Stephen whispered to Peter, nodding toward her. Peter glanced over, smirking. "That's Alexandra Sinclair, the merchant's daughter. She's got half the men in town chasing after her." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "You don't stand a chance, mate," Peter said with a chuckle. Stephen's grin widened. "We'll see about that." Chapter 2. The Meeting. The harbour bustled with its usual chaotic rhythm, a symphony of life orchestrated by the sea. The sun glared down on the docks, glinting off the rippling water and casting long shadows of masts that swayed gently with the tide. Fishermen yelled instructions to each other, merchants argued over prices, and children darted through the narrow gaps, their laughter rising above the din. The air was thick with the scent of salt, fish, and the faint trace of tar from newly repaired ships. Amid this vibrant cacophony, Alexandra Sinclair moved with poise and purpose. She was a striking figure in her tailored navy dress, her hat tipped just enough to shield her delicate features from the sun, while still allowing the light to catch the auburn strands of her hair. Her clipboard was clutched firmly in one hand, and she carried herself with an air of command that turned heads as she passed. She was here on business, overseeing the loading of textiles onto one of her father's merchant ships bound for a neighboring port. To Alexandra, the harbor was familiar but distant, a place she visited often but never truly felt a part of. The workers' shouts and the clatter of crates seemed to belong to another world, one far removed from the polished halls of the Sinclair estate. And yet she admired their dedication, the way they worked with grit and camaraderie. It was a life she couldn't imagine living, but couldn't help respecting. Her father's foreman, a wiry man named Harold, approached her with a clipboard of his own. "Miss Sinclair," he began, his voice gruff but respectful. "We've accounted for all but one crate. The supplier claims it'll be here before the tide changes." "Make sure it's loaded as soon as it arrives," Alexandra replied, her voice steady. "This shipment needs to depart on schedule." "Yes, ma'am," Harold said with a nod before hurrying off. As Alexandra scanned the bustling scene before her, her attention was drawn to a group of fishermen unloading their catch a few docks over. Among them was a man who seemed to stand out from the rest. His shirt, damp with sweat, clung to his lean, muscular frame, and his brown hair was tousled in a way that suggested he'd been working hard, yet barely noticed. He moved with a fluid confidence, lifting crates as if they weighed nothing, his sun-kissed skin glowing in the light. And then there was his smile, effortless, charming, and utterly magnetic. Stephen's perspective. Stephen Taylor was having a good day. The haul had been plentiful, the weather was favorable, and his mood was buoyed by the lively banter of his fellow fishermen. Stephen wiped his hands on his trousers and adjusted the collar of his shirt. As Alexandra walked past, he tipped his hat, his grin turning into a playful smirk. "Good afternoon, Miss Sinclair." Alexandra stopped, momentarily caught off guard. It wasn't often that someone addressed her so boldly. She turned to face him, her green eyes meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Good afternoon," she replied, her tone polite but cool. Stephen wasn't deterred. "Busy day at the docks?" "Always," Alexandra said, her grip tightening on her clipboard. "And you?" "Just another day in paradise," he said with a chuckle, gesturing to the crates around him. Alexandra allowed herself a small smile. "Paradise is a generous description." Stephen shrugged, his grin never wavering. "Depends on how you look at it." Before she could reply, Harold appeared at her side, his presence breaking the moment. "Miss Sinclair, the final crate has arrived. Shall we begin loading?" "Yes, thank you," Alexandra said, her attention snapping back to her responsibilities. She nodded once at Stephen before walking away, leaving him watching her retreating figure with a newfound interest. Their worlds collide. Over the following weeks, Stephen and Alexandra's paths seemed to cross more often. Whether at the market, the docks, or even the town square, they found themselves exchanging brief glances and polite nods. For Alexandra, Stephen was a puzzle, rough around the edges, but undeniably charming. For Stephen, Alexandra was a challenge, a world apart from the women he usually knew, and yet something about her drew him in. One evening, Alexandra found herself walking along the harbour, seeking a moment of quiet after a particularly demanding day. The sun was setting, casting the water in hues of gold and orange. She stopped by the edge of the dock, the sound of the waves soothing her frayed nerves. "Trouble at the office?" A familiar voice called out. She turned to see Stephen approaching, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn trousers. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a hint of the tanned skin beneath. "Not exactly," Alexandra replied, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Sometimes I just need to get away." Stephen leaned against a nearby post, studying her. "Even queens need a break from their thrones." Alexandra raised an eyebrow, both amused and slightly annoyed. "I didn't realize I was royalty." Stephen shrugged, his grin playful. "You certainly carry yourself like one." For a moment they stood in silence, the waves lapping gently against the dock. Then Alexandra spoke, her voice softer. "Why are you always so confident?" Stephen tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "I've learned that life's too short to be anything else. The sea can take you in an instant. You've got to grab every moment while you can." Alexandra regarded him carefully. "That sounds reckless." "Maybe," Stephen admitted, "but it's also honest." A growing curiosity. Their conversation left Alexandra with more questions than answers. Stephen's carefree nature was so different from her structured world, yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. Meanwhile, Stephen found himself thinking about Alexandra far more often than he expected. She was everything he wasn't, refined, responsible, and seemingly untouchable. And yet, she had spoken to him, shared a moment with him by the harbour. Their next encounter came when Alexandra visited the market to oversee a delivery of goods. Stephen, ever the opportunist, saw her inspecting the shipment and approached with his usual swagger. "Need help counting crates, Miss Sinclair?" he teased. Alexandra glanced at him, her lips curving into a small smile despite herself. "I think I can manage." "Just thought I'd offer," Stephen said, leaning casually against a stack of barrels. "You know, in the spirit of neighborly kindness." Alexandra shook her head, amused. "You're incorrigible." "And you're beautiful," Stephen said without hesitation, his tone sincere. Alexandra's smile faltered, her cheeks flushing. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" Stephen asked, his eyes locking with hers. "It's true." For a moment they stood there, the bustling market fading into the background. Alexandra felt her heart race, caught between propriety and something she couldn't quite name. "Stephen," she said softly, "we come from different worlds." "Maybe," he replied, stepping closer. "But the sea connects every shore, doesn't it?" Chapter 3. Building a Connection. The days in West Haven rolled by like the tides, steady and unyielding, yet never quite the same. The townsfolk busied themselves with their routines, unaware that amid the familiar rhythms of their harbour town, a quiet but profound connection was forming between two souls from very different worlds. A morning at the Sinclair estate. The Sinclair estate was a world apart from the bustling harbour. Perched atop a hill overlooking the sea, the grand home was a testament to Edward Sinclair's success. Its tall windows glinted in the sunlight, offering sweeping views of the ocean and the town below. The gardens were meticulously kept, with roses blooming in neat rows, and a stone pathway winding toward a wrought-iron gate. Inside, Alexandra sat at the mahogany dining table, poring over ledgers and correspondence. Her father's booming voice carried from the study down the hall, where he was meeting with shipbuilders about their next vessel. The faint clink of china signaled the arrival of tea, brought in by their housekeeper, Mrs. Elms. "Miss Sinclair," Mrs. Elms said softly, setting down the tray. "You've been at this all morning. Perhaps it's time for a break." Alexandra smiled up at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Elms, but I have to finish these accounts before Father's meeting." Mrs. Elms hesitated, her weathered face showing concern. "You work so hard, dear. Don't forget to enjoy the day." The housekeeper's words lingered in Alexandra's mind as she returned to her work. She loved her family and the responsibilities that came with being a Sinclair, but there were days when the weight of it all felt suffocating. Her life was a series of expectations, always poised, always perfect, always thinking 3 steps ahead. And yet, in the past few weeks, a small spark of something different had entered her world. That spark had a name: Stephen Taylor. She thought about their conversations, his disarming smile, and the way he looked at her. Not as Edward Sinclair's daughter, but as Alexandra, a woman with her own thoughts and dreams. It was unsettling and exhilarating all at once. Stephen's world. Down by the harbour, Stephen Taylor was hard at work. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the docks as he and Peter hauled crates of salted fish to a waiting merchant vessel. The air was heavy with the tang of brine and the occasional squawk of seagulls circling overhead. "Careful with that one," Peter grunted, pointing to a particularly heavy crate. "If it falls, we're not getting paid." Stephen smirked, wiping sweat from his brow. "You worry too much, Peter." "You don't worry enough," Peter shot back, though his tone was more amused than irritated. The two friends worked well together, their movements synchronized from years of partnership. But today, Stephen's thoughts were elsewhere. He kept glancing toward the marketplace, wondering if he might catch a glimpse of Alexandra. "You've been distracted lately?" Peter remarked as they finished loading the last crate. "Don't tell me it's because of her." Stephen paused, feigning innocence. "Her who?" Peter rolled his eyes. "You know exactly who I mean. Alexandra Sinclair." Stephen leaned against a barrel, his grin widening. "Maybe. What's it to you?" Peter shook his head. "She's trouble, Stephen. Not because of who she is, but because of who you're not. You think her father's going to let her keep company with a fisherman?" Stephen's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Maybe not. But she's not her father." Peter sighed, placing a hand on Stephen's shoulder. "Just don't get your hopes up, mate. The higher you climb, the harder the fall." A quiet moment later that afternoon, Stephen found himself wandering along the cliffs that overlooked the sea. It was one of his favorite places, a spot where he could think without the distractions of the harbor. The waves crashed against the rocks below, their rhythm soothing and constant. He sat on a flat boulder, his thoughts drifting back to Alexandra. There was something about her that unsettled him in the best way possible. She was poised and elegant, but there was a spark beneath her polished exterior, a spark that hinted at a longing for something more. Stephen had never been one to chase after unattainable dreams, but Alexandra wasn't just a dream. She was real, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he felt drawn to her. The unexpected meeting. That evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Painting the sky in hues of gold and orange, Alexandra walked along the harbour. She told herself it was simply a way to clear her mind after a long day, but deep down she hoped to see Stephen. There was a magnetic quality to him, an energy that both intrigued and unsettled her. She found him near the end of the dock, leaning against a wooden post with his hands in his pockets. He was watching the water, his expression unusually thoughtful. When he noticed her approaching, his face lit up with a smile. "Miss Sinclair," he said, straightening. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" Alexandra hesitated, suddenly unsure of herself. "I needed some fresh air," she replied, "and I thought I might find you here." Stephen raised an eyebrow, his grin turning mischievous. "You were looking for me? I'm flattered." Alexandra rolled her eyes, though she couldn't suppress a small smile. "Don't let it go to your head." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sound of the waves filling the air. Then Stephen spoke, his tone quieter. "You don't seem like the type to wander the docks alone. What's on your mind?" Alexandra looked out at the horizon, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder what it's like to live without expectations, to wake up and do exactly what you want, without worrying about what others think." Stephen studied her, his hazel eyes softening. "It's not as easy as it sounds," he said, "but it's worth it." She turned to him, her gaze searching. "And what is it you want, Stephen?" He hesitated, the question catching him off guard. For once, his usual bravado faltered. "I don't know," he admitted, "but lately I think I'm starting to figure it out." Their eyes met, and in that moment the differences between them seemed to fade away. They were just two people standing at the edge of the world, searching for something neither could name. An unspoken understanding. As the days turned into weeks, Stephen and Alexandra continued to meet in quiet moments stolen from their busy lives. Sometimes they walked along the beach, their conversations light and playful. Other times they sat on the cliffs, sharing their dreams and fears. For Alexandra, Stephen represented a freedom she had never known, a life unbound by the expectations of wealth and status. For Stephen, Alexandra was a reminder that there was more to life than fleeting pleasures. She challenged him, inspired him, and made him want to be better. The town, of course, noticed their growing connection. Whispers spread like wildfire, some amused, others disapproving. But Stephen and Alexandra paid no mind. In their hearts, they knew what they were building was rare and real. Chapter 4. Love and Expectations. The connection between Stephen and Alexandra grew like a fragile vine, winding its way through the cracks in the walls they'd built around themselves. Each meeting strengthened their bond, but the closer they grew, the more complicated their world became. For Stephen, Alexandra was a beacon of elegance and warmth, drawing him into a life he'd never dared to imagine. For Alexandra, Stephen was a breath of fresh air, someone who saw her as more than her name or status. But the expectations of their separate worlds loomed over them, threatening to tear them apart before they'd truly begun. A forbidden courtship. The townsfolk of West Haven were not blind to the burgeoning relationship between the fisherman and the merchant's daughter. Whispers grew louder with each passing day, carried on the salty breeze through market stalls, taverns, and drawing rooms. "They've been seen walking together on the cliffs," a merchant's wife whispered to her friend. "It's improper," the friend replied, her voice tinged with disapproval. "Edward Sinclair won't stand for it. Mark my words, he'll put an end to it." At the Sinclair estate, the tension was palpable. Alexandra's mother, Margaret, was the first to voice her concerns. She confronted her daughter one evening as they sat in the drawing room, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Alexandra," Margaret began, her tone sharp yet measured. "I've heard unsettling rumors about your association with that fisherman." Alexandra looked up from her book, her expression calm but resolute. "His name is Stephen." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I don't care what his name is. He's beneath you. Do you have any idea what people are saying?" "I don't care what they say," Alexandra replied, her voice steady. "Stephen is kind, intelligent, and completely unsuitable," Margaret interrupted. "You are the daughter of Edward Sinclair. Your future is already laid out for you, Alexandra. You can't afford to throw it away on a whim." Alexandra set her book aside, her patience waning. "A whim? Is that what you think this is?" Margaret sighed, softening slightly. "I know you, Alexandra. You've always wanted more than what this town can offer. But this is not the way to find it." Alexandra didn't respond, her jaw tightening as she stared into the fire. She knew her mother's words came from a place of love, but they stung nonetheless. How could she explain that Stephen made her feel alive in a way she never had before? Stephen's struggles. On the other side of town, Stephen faced his own challenges. His friends, who had always admired his carefree nature, now regarded him with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You're playing with fire, Stephen," Peter warned one evening at the tavern. "The Sinclair family isn't like us. They have power, influence. If they decide you're a problem, they'll make sure you know it." Stephen took a swig of his ale, his jaw tightening. "I'm not afraid of them." "You should be," Peter said. "You're not just risking your reputation, you're risking hers too." Stephen sighed, setting his mug down. He knew Peter was right. Alexandra's reputation was already under scrutiny because of him, and the thought of causing her any harm weighed heavily on his conscience. That night, as he lay in his small, weathered bed, Stephen stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about Alexandra's laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams. He thought about the warmth of her hand in his, and the way she made him believe he could be more than he was. But he also thought about the whispers, the judgment, and the invisible barrier between their worlds. Could he really ask her to sacrifice so much for him? A moment of doubt, the tension between their love and the expectations of their respective worlds, came to a head during a town festival. The event was held every autumn, a celebration of the sea's bounty and the community's hard work. Lanterns were strung along the docks, and the air was filled with music, laughter, and the scent of roasted fish. Stephen and Alexandra arrived separately, careful not to draw too much attention. But as the night wore on, they found themselves drawn to each other. They slipped away from the crowd, seeking refuge in a quiet corner of the harbour. "You look beautiful," Stephen said, his voice soft as he took in her emerald green gown. "And you look entirely out of place," Alexandra teased, though her smile betrayed her affection. He wore a simple white shirt and dark trousers, his hair slightly tousled in the evening breeze. They stood close, the sounds of the festival fading into the background. For a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. "Do you ever wish things were simpler?" Alexandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Stephen nodded. "Every day. But life isn't simple, is it?" She looked down, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this. Stephen's chest tightened. Are you saying you want to stop? No, Alexandra said quickly, meeting his gaze. But I don't want to hurt you, or myself. Stephen reached out, gently taking her hand. Alexandra, I don't care what people think. All I care about is you. Her eyes filled with tears, and she smiled despite herself. You make it sound so easy. It's not, Stephen admitted, but some things are worth fighting for. A growing divide. Despite their resolve, the pressures of their worlds continued to creep in. Alexandra's father, Edward Sinclair, began to notice her distracted demeanor during meetings. One evening, he confronted her in his study, his voice low but firm. Alexandra, I've heard whispers about your involvement with that fisherman, Edward said, his sharp gaze fixed on her. Is there any truth to it? Alexandra hesitated, her heart pounding. Stephen is a good man, father. He's hard-working, kind. He's not suitable for you, Edward interrupted, his tone final. You have responsibilities, Alexandra. Your actions reflect on this family. I won't have you jeopardizing our name for whatever this is. It's not just this, Alexandra said, her voice trembling. I care about him. Edward's expression softened slightly, but his words remained firm. You're young, Alexandra. You don't understand the consequences of your choices. One day, you'll thank me for protecting you. Alexandra left the study feeling more trapped than ever. She loved her family, but their expectations felt like a cage, keeping her from the life she wanted. Stephen, too, felt the strain. He began to consider what he could offer Alexandra, how he could prove himself worthy of her love. He started taking on extra work, saving every coin he could in the hopes of one day buying his own fishing vessel. To him, the boat represented freedom, a chance to build a future where he and Alexandra could be together without judgment. But, as the days turned into weeks, the divide between their worlds seemed to grow wider. The whispers grew louder, the stares more pointed. And though their love remained strong, both Stephen and Alexandra began to wonder, could it survive the weight of the world around them? Chapter 5. Love and Betrayal. The tension between Stephen and Alexandra had become palpable, an invisible thread pulled taut by the weight of societal expectations and the growing whispers in the town. Yet, despite the pressures, they clung to their moments together, determined to hold on to the connection that had become their sanctuary. But love, no matter how strong, is rarely simple. And for Stephen and Alexandra, the complexities of their lives and the choices they made would soon lead them down a path of heartache and regret. An evening of escape. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the town of West Haven bathed in moonlight. Alexandra slipped out of the Sinclair estate, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders to ward off the evening chill. She had told her parents she was retiring early, feigning a headache to avoid their prying questions. In truth, she was meeting Stephen by the cliffs, a spot that had become their secret haven. Stephen was already there when she arrived, leaning against a weathered boulder with his hands in his pockets. He straightened when he saw her, his face breaking into a grin that made her heart skip a beat. "You're late," he teased, his voice low but warm. "I had to wait until the house was quiet," Alexandra replied, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "My mother has been watching me like a hawk." Stephen's expression softened as he stepped closer, his rough hands reaching out to take hers. "I'm sorry, Alexandra. I hate that this is so hard for you." She shook her head, her emerald eyes meeting his. "It's not your fault. I knew what I was risking when we started this." They sat together on the grass, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below, filling the silence between them. Stephen told her about his day on the water, the stubbornness of the fish, and the antics of his crewmates. Alexandra listened intently, her laughter coming easily as he recounted Peter's failed attempt to fix a net. "You make even the worst days sound like an adventure," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. Stephen wrapped an arm around her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Every day with you is an adventure." For a moment, the world felt far away, but as they sat there, the weight of their reality crept back in. Alexandra knew her parents would never accept Stephen, just as Stephen knew the town would always see him as unworthy of her. The knowledge hung between them like a storm cloud, unspoken but undeniable. A tempting distraction. As the weeks passed, the strain began to take its toll on Stephen. He loved Alexandra deeply, but the whispers and judgment of the town wore on him. He felt as though he was constantly fighting an uphill battle, trying to prove himself to a world that refused to see his worth. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at sea, Stephen found himself at the tavern with Peter and a few other crewmates. The air was thick with the scent of ale and smoke, and the lively chatter of the patrons provided a welcome distraction from his thoughts. At the bar, a young woman caught his eye. Her name was Lily, a vivacious and flirtatious barmaid with a mischievous smile. She had always been friendly with Stephen, often teasing him as she poured his drinks. Tonight, however, her attention felt different, more pointed. "You look like you could use a drink," Lily said, sliding a mug of ale toward him. Stephen chuckled, his tired eyes meeting hers. "You're not wrong." Lily leaned closer, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "And maybe a bit of company, too?" Peter raised an eyebrow from across the table but said nothing, his expression unreadable. Stephen hesitated, a pang of guilt twisting in his chest. He thought of Alexandra, of the way her smile lit up his world. But tonight, the weight of their impossible situation felt heavier than ever. It was just a drink, he told himself. Just a harmless conversation. The cost of a mistake. What began as a harmless conversation quickly spiraled into something more. The warmth of the ale, combined with Lily's laughter and attention, dulled Stephen's judgment. By the end of the evening, he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The next morning, Stephen awoke with a pounding headache and a sinking feeling in his stomach. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and with them, a crushing wave of regret. He had betrayed Alexandra, the one person who had always believed in him. Peter's words from the night before echoed in his mind. "You're playing with fire, Stephen. Don't let it burn you." Stephen buried his face in his hands, shame washing over him like the tide. He knew he had to tell Alexandra, but the thought of seeing the hurt in her eyes made him hesitate. How could he face her, knowing what he had done? The confrontation, when Stephen finally mustered the courage to meet Alexandra, it was clear she already knew something was wrong. Her usual warmth was replaced by a guardedness that made his chest ache. "Stephen," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Is there something you need to tell me?" He looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "Alexandra, I made a mistake." Her breath hitched, and for a moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice trembling with hurt, she asked, "What kind of mistake?" Stephen forced himself to look at her, his hazel eyes filled with remorse. "It didn't mean anything. I was drunk, and I wasn't thinking. I'm so sorry, Alexandra." Her hands clenched at her sides, her face pale. "It didn't mean anything?" she repeated, her voice breaking. "Do you have any idea how much this means to me? To us?" "Alexandra, please," Stephen said, stepping toward her. "I love you. I made a terrible mistake, but it doesn't change how I feel about you." She took a step back, shaking her head. "You betrayed me, Stephen. How am I supposed to trust you after this?" He reached for her, but she turned away, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought we could make this work, but maybe we were wrong. Alexandra." "Goodbye, Stephen," she said, cutting him off, and with that she walked away, leaving him standing alone on the cliff where they had shared so many happy moments. The aftermath. The days that followed were some of the darkest Stephen had ever known. He threw himself into his work, hoping the physical labor would drown out the ache in his chest. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the memory of Alexandra's tears or the pain in her voice. Alexandra, too, was struggling. She buried herself in her responsibilities, trying to convince herself that walking away had been the right choice. But every time she passed the cliffs or the harbor, she thought of Stephen, and her heart broke all over again. The town, of course, was abuzz with gossip. Some sided with Alexandra, praising her for ending things with Stephen. Others pitied Stephen, saying he had let a moment of weakness ruin something beautiful. But none of the whispers mattered to either of them. They were too consumed by their own pain to care about what anyone else thought. Chapter 6. Separation and Growth. The once vibrant connection between Stephen and Alexandra now lay fractured, its remnants scattered across the quiet harbour town of Westhaven. The days following their confrontation were heavy with unspoken pain and regret. Both Stephen and Alexandra tried to carry on with their lives, but the memories of their love haunted them like shadows that refused to fade. Stephen's despair. Stephen threw himself into his work with a fervor that bordered on recklessness. Each day he rose before the sun and took to the sea, pushing himself harder than ever. His hands, once steady and skilled, were now rough and calloused from hauling heavier nets and working long hours without rest. Peter watched him with growing concern. "Stephen, you're going to burn yourself out," he said one evening as they unloaded the day's catch. Stephen shrugged, his expression distant. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Peter said, crossing his arms. "You're punishing yourself. For what? A mistake? You think working yourself to death is going to fix anything?" Stephen paused, his shoulders sagging under the weight of Peter's words. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hurt her, Peter. I betrayed her. How do you come back from that?" Peter sighed, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "You can't change what happened, Stephen, but you can change what happens next. Maybe it's time to figure out what you really want." Alexandra's struggle. At the Sinclair estate, Alexandra's days were filled with responsibilities, yet they felt emptier than ever. She oversaw shipments, balanced accounts, and attended meetings with merchants, but her heart wasn't in it. Her mind kept drifting back to Stephen, the warmth of his smile, the way he made her feel alive, and the pain in his eyes when he had confessed his mistake. Her mother, Margaret, noticed the change in her daughter. One evening, as they sat in the drawing room, Margaret set down her embroidery and turned to Alexandra. "You've been quiet lately," she said gently. "Is something troubling you?" Alexandra hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. "I'm fine, Mother. Just tired." Margaret studied her daughter, her sharp eyes softening. I know things haven't been easy for you, Alexandra. Love is complicated, and people make mistakes. But don't let one moment define your future. Alexandra looked up, surprised by her mother's words. I thought you disapproved of Stephen. I do, Margaret admitted. But I also see how much you cared for him. Sometimes, forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about setting yourself free. A chance encounter. Weeks turned into months, and life in West Haven carried on. The autumn winds brought a chill to the air, and the leaves along the cliffs turned shades of amber and gold. One crisp morning, as Alexandra walked through the market to inspect a shipment, she spotted Stephen in the distance. He was helping an elderly woman load her cart with firewood, his movements quick and efficient. For a moment, Alexandra stood frozen, her heart pounding. She hadn't seen him since their parting, and the sight of him brought a rush of emotions she couldn't quite name. Stephen caught her gaze and froze, the firewood slipping from his hands. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to pause around them. Alexandra took a step forward, then stopped, unsure of what to say. Miss Sinclair, Stephen said finally, his voice tinged with both surprise and longing. Stephen, she replied, her voice soft. She glanced at the woman he was helping, then back at him. You're as helpful as ever, I see. Stephen managed a faint smile. Just trying to make myself useful. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Alexandra wanted to ask how he was, to tell him how much she missed him, but the weight of their history held her back. I should go, she said finally, her heart aching as she turned to leave. Alexandra, Stephen called after her. She stopped, but didn't turn around. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. For everything. She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I know, she whispered, before walking away. Stephen's turning point, that encounter stayed with Stephen, haunting him as much as it motivated him. He realized he couldn't keep living the way he was, adrift and directionless. If he wanted to be someone worthy of Alexandra's love, he needed to change. He began saving every coin he earned, cutting back on nights at the tavern, and focusing on his dream of owning a fishing vessel. He also started volunteering around town, helping the elderly with chores and teaching young boys the art of fishing. Slowly, his reputation began to shift, and the whispers about him took on a more positive tone. Stephen Taylor's turning over a new leaf, one fisherman remarked. Maybe he's finally growing up. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the noise of the festival fading into the background. I heard about your boat, Alexandra said finally, her voice soft. Stephen nodded. It's not much, but it's a start. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Alexandra saw the man Stephen had become, determined, humble, and full of potential. She stepped closer, her voice trembling with emotion. I've missed you. Stephen reached for her hand, his own shaking. I've missed you too, Alexandra, more than I can say. Tears glistened in her eyes as she smiled. Maybe it's time we stopped letting the world decide for us. Stephen pulled her into a gentle embrace, the weight of their past mistakes and regrets lifting as they held each other. For the first time in months, they felt a sense of peace. Chapter 7. The Path to Reconciliation. The reconciliation between Stephen and Alexandra, though beautiful in its simplicity, was a journey far from over. While their reunion at the Harvest Festival had rekindled hope, the challenges they faced together were multifaceted, rooted not only in their past mistakes, but also in the lingering judgment of the world around them. This chapter delves deeper into their shared efforts to rebuild trust, face societal scrutiny, and carve out a future that felt truly their own. It is a tale of resilience, quiet moments of love, and the transformative power of forgiveness. The morning after. Hope and hesitation. Stephen woke before dawn, as was his habit, but this time his heart was lighter. The memory of Alexandra's tearful smile and the warmth of her embrace filled his mind. He sat at the edge of his bed, running a hand through his unruly hair. His room, small but tidy, reflected the man he was striving to become. Modest, yet determined. The golden hues of the sunrise filtered through his window, bathing the wooden floors in soft light. Stephen reached for the small chest beside his bed, pulling out a leather-bound journal. The journal had been his companion through the months of heartache, its pages filled with sketches of boats, notes about repairs, and occasional letters he had never sent to Alexandra. Flipping to a blank page, Stephen wrote, "Today begins the rest of our story. I'll prove to her, and to myself, that love is worth fighting for." At the Sinclair estate, Alexandra stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the town below. The cliffs where she and Stephen had shared so many moments loomed in the distance, bathed in the soft morning light. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, as if shielding herself from the whirlwind of emotions within. Her mother's words from the night before echoed in her mind. Forgiveness isn't about them. It's about setting yourself free. But forgiveness, Alexandra realized, wasn't a single act. It was a process. And while she had taken the first step by meeting Stephen halfway, the road ahead would require patience, vulnerability, and an openness she wasn't sure she was ready for. Rebuilding trust. Stephen wasted no time proving his commitment to change. He sought out small ways to show Alexandra that he valued her trust, bringing fresh flowers to the Sinclair estate, offering to assist with errands, and including her in conversations about his boat repairs. He wanted her to see that his love for her extended beyond grand gestures. It was in the everyday acts of care and respect. One crisp morning, Alexandra found herself at the docks, watching Stephen work. His movements were purposeful and fluid, each task executed with the precision of someone who had spent years mastering his craft. He glanced up and noticed her, his smile soft but filled with a mix of pride and nervousness. "Miss Sinclair," he called out, setting down a crate of supplies. "What brings you to my corner of the world?" Alexandra smiled, stepping closer. "I wanted to see your progress. Peter said the repairs are coming along well." Stephen wiped his hands on a cloth, his hazel eyes gleaming. "They are. She'll be seaworthy in no time, maybe even good enough for you to set foot on." Alexandra raised an eyebrow, her tone playful. "I'll hold you to that." The easy banter between them felt natural, but beneath it lay an undercurrent of emotion. Stephen knew every small moment with Alexandra was a chance to prove his sincerity. He was willing to wait, no matter how long it took, for her trust to be fully restored. Facing the town's judgment. While Stephen and Alexandra found solace in each other, the town of West Haven was slower to accept their reconciliation. The whispers that had once faded now returned with renewed fervor. "Have you seen them together?" a woman in the marketplace whispered to her companion. "It's scandalous." "She's throwing away her future," the companion replied, shaking her head. "And for what? A fisherman?" Even Peter, Stephen's closest friend, expressed his concerns one evening as they shared a quiet drink at the tavern. "You know I'm on your side," Peter said, his tone serious. "But people in this town don't forget easily. They'll always look at her and see the Sinclair daughter who chose the wrong man." Stephen set his mug down, his jaw tightening. "She's not the wrong anything. She's everything." Peter sighed, placing a hand on Stephen's shoulder. "I hope you're right, mate, for both your sakes." Alexandra, too, faced her share of scrutiny. At a luncheon hosted by one of her family's associates, the conversation turned pointedly to her personal life. "Alexandra, darling," one woman began, her tone laced with feigned concern. "We've heard rumors about you and that fisherman." Alexandra's smile didn't waver, though her grip on her teacup tightened. "Stephen Taylor," she said calmly. "And yes, we're together." The woman exchanged a glance with another guest, her lips pursing. "It's admirable, really, your open-mindedness." "Thank you," Alexandra replied, her tone cool. "I'll take that as a compliment." Her composure never faltered, but as the luncheon wore on, she felt the sting of their judgment. That evening, she confided in her father, Edward, who had remained silent about her relationship with Stephen since giving his blessing. "They're relentless," Alexandra said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Why can't they just let us be?" Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Because they envy what they don't understand, and because change frightens them. But let me ask you this. Do you regret your choice?" Alexandra shook her head, her eyes unwavering. "Not for a moment." "Then let them talk," Edward said firmly. "Their opinions don't define you." Building a life together, Stephen's boat repairs became a community effort, with friends and neighbors pitching in to help. Peter, despite his initial reservations, became one of Stephen's staunchest supporters, offering his skills and encouragement. On the day the boat was finally ready to sail, Stephen invited Alexandra to see it. She arrived at the docks, her heart swelling with pride as she took in the sight of the restored vessel. Its polished wood gleamed in the sunlight, and its sails billowed gently in the breeze. "What do you think?" Stephen asked, his grin wide. "It's beautiful," Alexandra said, her voice filled with awe. "You've done an incredible job." Stephen extended a hand, helping her onto the deck. "I couldn't have done it without you." Their first sail together was a quiet, reflective journey along the coast. As the boat glided through the water, Alexandra felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. She stood at the bow, the wind tugging at her hair, and Stephen watched her with a mixture of love and gratitude. "This is just the beginning," he said, joining her at the railing. "For us, for everything." Alexandra smiled, her heart full. "I believe you," a celebration of love. Months later, the town of West Haven gathered once again for a celebration, this time for Stephen and Alexandra's wedding. The ceremony was held on the cliffs where their love had first blossomed, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the scene. Alexandra wore a simple but elegant gown, her auburn hair adorned with wildflowers. Stephen, dressed in his best suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle. Their vows were heartfelt, spoken with tears and laughter, and when they kissed, the crowd erupted into cheers. The reception that followed was a joyous affair, filled with music, dancing, and heartfelt toasts. Even those who had once doubted their union couldn't help but be moved by the love they shared. A future full of promise. As the years passed, Stephen and Alexandra built a life together that was both humble and extraordinary. Stephen's fishing business thrived, and Alexandra continued to manage her family's affairs with grace and skill. Together, They became pillars of the West Haven community, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and forgiveness. And though the whispers never truly faded, Stephen and Alexandra learned to let them drift away like the tides, their love an anchor in a world that was always changing. Dear listener, thank you for sticking with us until the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. This story is one of my favorite, especially because I know it's true. And Stephen and Alexandra are still alive and working in love and charity in their fishing town. Again, I'm going to ask you to subscribe to my channel, like and share. And not least, write in the comment column where you are from. In which country do you live? I love seeing how far my stories go. And maybe you also write how you liked the story. Every day I come across people who have beautiful life experiences that are worth telling about. You can contact me and give me a tip. But until next time.
In a harbor town where the waves collide, a fisherman dreamed by the ocean side. She was elegant, a light so rare, a daughter of fortune beyond compare. They met where the cliffs kissed the endless sea, two hearts drawn together impossibly. But whispers rose like a chilling breeze, two different worlds never meant to be. Under the same sky where the stars align, two souls bound by love, though the world draws a line. Through the storm and whispers, they'll hold on tight. Under the same sky, love shines through the night. His hands were rough like the ropes he'd tied. Her touch was soft, but her spirit high. They danced on the edge of what could not be, defying the tide, longing to be free. The town spoke of rules and the price they'd pay, but their hearts sang a tune that would not obey. In the shadows they dreamed of a brighter morn, a love so fierce it could weather the storm. Under the same sky where the stars align, two souls bound by love, though the world draws a line. Through the storm and whispers, they'll hold on tight. Under the same sky, love shines through the night. Oh, the sea knows no borders, the wind knows no chains. Their love was a fire that burned through the rains. In the face of the whispers, in the face of the cold, their hearts wrote a story of daring and bold. Through trials and sorrow, they found their way, building a life in the light of day. The fisherman's hands and the heiress's grace, together they crafted a sacred space. Though the world never ceased to raise its voice, they stood by each other, a resolute choice. The love they discovered was worth